You might not realize this, but some of the most important meals in American history have completely vanished from our kitchens. These weren't just recipes, they were lifelines. Dishes born during the Great Depression and wartime America, when survival depended on stretching every crumb, every scrap, and every ounce of creativity. And today, I'm going to bring those forgotten meals back to life. Trust me, if you stay with me until the end of this video, you'll discover recipes so unique, so deeply tied to survival and family traditions, that you'll walk away feeling like you've uncovered a secret piece of history. Picture the 1930s, the economy had collapsed, shelves were bare, and yet families gathered together around bowls of Hoover stew or slices of mock apple pie, desserts made without apples at all. These meals weren't about luxury, they were about hope. They reminded struggling families that even when money was gone, love and resourcefulness could still fill the table. Then came World War II, and ration books changed the way America ate. Meat, sugar, and even coffee were scarce. Out of necessity came clever recipes like Victory Garden soups, stretchable casseroles, and even substitute coffee made from chicory. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept people going. These recipes told stories of resilience, sacrifice, and the unbreakable spirit of everyday families. What makes these forgotten meals so powerful is not just the taste, it's the memory. They connect us to grandparents and great-grandparents who lived through times tougher than most of us can imagine. And today, I want to share them with you, not as old, dusty recipes, but as living history. So grab a seat, stay with me until the very end, and let's step into the kitchens of the past. Because once you see these 10 forgotten wartime and Depression-era recipes, you'll never look at food the same way again. And hey, if you love uncovering hidden traditions, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share your thought. Mock apple pie might sound like a trick, and in many ways, it was. Imagine craving the warmth of a sweet apple pie during the Great Depression, yet finding no apples at all. Fresh fruit was either too expensive or nearly impossible to find in some towns. But families didn't give up. Instead, they invented a clever substitute that carried the taste of comfort without the cost, a pie made from nothing more than crackers, sugar, and spices. This dish tells the story of how resourceful home cooks were during desperate times. Housewives learned to fake it by boiling water with sugar, cinnamon, and a splash of lemon juice to create that familiar tart sweet apple flavor. Then they layered broken crackers in place of apples, poured the syrup over them, and tucked it all into a flaky crust. Once baked, it looked, and shockingly, even tasted, like a real apple pie. Neighbors and children often didn't know the difference, and many families considered it a small miracle at the dinner table. But mock apple pie wasn't just about tricking taste buds. It was about preserving tradition. Pie had always been a symbol of celebration, family, and togetherness in America. To lose it during hard times would have been another painful reminder of what was missing. Instead, this clever creation gave families a way to keep joy alive, even when money was scarce. Some even passed the recipe down through generations as a proud reminder of survival. It showed that no matter how little they had, they could still gather around the table with something that felt familiar, warm, and sweet. So while today we might smile at the idea of pie without apples, for Depression-era families, mock apple pie was more than dessert. It was a quiet victory, a reminder that creativity could turn emptiness into abundance, and hardship into hope. Mulligan stew wasn't just a meal, it was a story told in every spoonful. Born out of poverty and wanderlust, this stew became famous among the hobos of the Great Depression, men who rode the rails in search of work, carrying little more than hope in their pockets. The genius of Mulligan stew was that it was never exactly the same twice. Imagine a campfire glowing near the railroad tracks, with a battered pot hanging over the flames. Each man contributed whatever scraps he had, a potato here, a carrot there, maybe a piece of onion, a bit of meat, or sometimes just beans. They would toss everything into the pot, stir it together, and share one meal as equals. It didn't matter who brought the most or who brought the least, because by combining it all, everyone ate. This dish captured the very spirit of survival and community. When times were cruel and stomachs were empty, mulligan stew turned strangers into brothers. It was less about the taste and more about the act of sharing. For many, this stew was the difference between going hungry and finding a little warmth at the end of a long, uncertain day. But mulligan stew wasn't confined to hobo camps. Families struggling at home also adopted the idea, throwing together whatever's on hand into a single pot. It might be thin, sometimes watery, but it was filling enough to stretch across a household of hungry mouths. It became a Depression-era tradition of resourcefulness, a reminder that even scraps had value when shared with love. Today, mulligan stew is rarely remembered, but its lesson remains timeless. It wasn't about exact recipes or perfect flavors, it was about survival, unity, and the power of coming together in hard times. A pot of stew could be poor in ingredients, but rich in spirit. Hoover stew, just the name alone carries echoes of the Great Depression. This wasn't a fancy dish, and it certainly wasn't born out of luxury. It was a survival meal, created in kitchens where money was scarce, cupboards were nearly empty, and families had to stretch every last ration just to make it through another day. The stew was named after President Herbert Hoover, who many blamed for the hardships of the Depression. It was cheap, filling, and relied on simple ingredients that could be bought with food stamps or rations. Housewives would toss macaroni, canned tomatoes, hot dogs, or bits of sausage, and sometimes beans or corn into a pot of water. It wasn't about flavor as much as it was about filling hungry stomachs with whatever was available. But here's where the story of Hoover stew becomes more than just food. For countless families, this humble meal represented resilience. Children would come home from school to the smell of it simmering on the stove, a reminder that even in the darkest times, there was still something warm to eat. It gave comfort when comfort was hard to find, and for many, it became a symbol of family unity, everyone gathering around one pot, sharing the same simple dish. The taste wasn't remarkable, but the memory was unforgettable. For those who lived through it, Hoover stew wasn't just about surviving hunger, it was about surviving history. Every bite carried the weight of struggle, resourcefulness, and the quiet determination of families who refused to give up. Today, Hoover stew has almost disappeared, remembered only in old cookbooks or whispered family stories. Yet, it remains one of the most iconic Depression-era meals, a reminder that even when the world feels empty, people can still create something that brings warmth to the table. Shipwreck casserole, a name that sounds dramatic, and in many ways, it truly was. This Depression and wartime dish got its name because it looked like a wreck once it came out of the oven. But for families living with ration books and empty wallets, it wasn't a disaster at all. It was a clever way to turn a handful of basic, affordable ingredients into a hearty, comforting meal that could stretch across an entire table. The beauty of shipwreck casserole was in its layers. Homemakers would slice up potatoes, onions, and sometimes carrots, then layer them with ground beef, canned beans, or whatever leftovers they had on hand. A can of tomato soup or stewed tomatoes was poured over the top, binding it all together before it baked into a bubbling, savory dish. When it came out of the oven, it wasn't pretty, but it was filling, and that's all that mattered. For many families, this casserole was survival food disguised as comfort. Children didn't care that the beef was stretched thin or that canned vegetables replaced fresh ones. What they remembered was the warmth, the smell of it cooking, and the feeling of gathering around the table when there wasn't much else to eat. It turned scarcity into something that felt abundant. The name shipwrecked may have sounded like chaos, but in truth, it carried a hidden meaning. Even in wreckage, whether financial, emotional, or social, something good could still be built. It symbolized resilience, families making the best of what they had and creating meals that carried them through. Today, shipwreck casserole has nearly vanished from kitchens, but its legacy is powerful. It wasn't just a pile of leftovers baked together, it was proof that during America's hardest times, families found ways to transform little into enough. Victory Garden vegetable soup wasn't just a dish, it was a patriotic act served in a bowl. During World War II, rationing was strict. Families were limited on meat, sugar, butter, and even canned goods. To ease the strain on the food supply, the government encouraged citizens to plant victory gardens in their backyards, empty lots, and even city parks. Out of these gardens came one of the simplest, yet most meaningful meals of the era, a vegetable soup made from whatever the earth could provide. Imagine a pot simmering on the stove, filled with carrots, beans, onions, cabbage, or potatoes, sometimes fresh, sometimes preserved for winter. Housewives proudly served this soup, knowing that every spoonful came from their own hands, their own soil. Children learned the value of food by helping weed, water, and harvest. Even though the soup was light and often meatless, it carried with it a deep sense of pride. This was food that supported the war effort, food that gave strength to families while soldiers fought overseas. Victory Garden soup was more than nourishment, it was community. Neighbors often traded crops, corn for beans, or tomatoes for squash, so everyone had a bit of variety in their pots. The act of planting, sharing, and cooking together strengthened the bonds between people during some of the most uncertain times in history. The taste of this soup was simple, even humble. But its meaning was enormous. Every bite was a reminder that even in struggle, Americans could unite, adapt, and thrive. A bowl of Victory Garden soup carried not just vegetables, but resilience, resourcefulness, and hope. Today, the recipe has nearly disappeared from dinner tables, but the spirit remains timeless. It reminds us that sometimes the simplest meals are the most powerful because they carry with them the story of survival, sacrifice, and unity. Stretch meatloaf, sometimes called Depression meatloaf, was a classic example of making a little go a long way. During the Great Depression and into wartime America, meat was one of the hardest and most expensive ingredients to keep on the table. Families couldn't afford to serve thick cuts of beef or roasts, so they had to be creative. Out of that struggle came this dish, meatloaf, that wasn't really all meat at all. The secret was in the fillers. Housewives would mix small amounts of ground beef with oats, breadcrumbs, crushed crackers, or even mashed beans. Some recipes used grated vegetables like carrots or onions to bulk it up. Then, it was shaped into a loaf, topped with ketchup or tomato sauce, and baked until firm. The result? A dish that looked hearty, tasted familiar, and could feed a whole family while using only a fraction of the meat. But stretch meatloaf was more than just thrifty cooking, it was dignity on a plate. In an era where pride was often tested, this meal gave families something that felt like tradition, like Sunday dinner, even when times were hard. Kids didn't notice the fillers, they just remembered the comforting smell coming from the oven and the way slices of meatloaf were shared out equally at the table. For many, it became a weekly staple, and even after the Depression ended, some families kept making it out of habit, or out of love for the taste that reminded them of home. It wasn't about being poor, it was about being clever, about finding ways to nourish the people you cared about no matter what. Today, the idea of stretching meat feels almost forgotten, but Depression meatloaf stands as a reminder of resilience. It taught families that survival wasn't just about having enough, it was about making enough out of what you had. Potato pancakes, sometimes called Depression latkes, were the kind of simple, humble dish that kept families going when money was tight. During the Great Depression, potatoes were cheap, filling, and easy to store, making them a true lifeline in American kitchens. Out of that necessity came these golden, crispy cakes, pan-fried to perfection and served hot at the table. The recipe was simple: grated potatoes, a bit of onion, maybe an egg if you could spare one, and flour or breadcrumbs to bind it all together. Housewives would fry them in a skillet until the edges turned crisp and golden brown. They weren't fancy, but they were satisfying, and with a few pancakes, a whole family could feel like they had eaten well. What made potato pancakes special wasn't just the taste, but the feeling they carried. For many children, this was a Sunday morning breakfast or a dinner served after long days of work and worry. The smell of potatoes frying in the pan brought comfort when everything else outside the home felt uncertain. Some families even topped them with applesauce, sour cream, or whatever scraps of preserves they had, giving the dish a small touch of sweetness. These pancakes also carried cultural echoes. Immigrant families from Europe, German, Polish, Jewish, already knew the tradition of potato cakes, and they passed it on to their American-born children. In the Depression years, those traditions blended into the wider culture, and the potato pancake became a survival food shared across communities. Even though they were cheap, they didn't feel like poor man's food. They felt like a treat, crispy, warm, and made with love. For many, a plate of potato pancakes was a reminder that joy could be found even in the simplest ingredients. Today, they've almost vanished from the everyday American table, but their story remains a powerful one. Sometimes, all you need is a potato, a hot skillet, and the will to make something out of nothing. Cornmeal mush was one of the simplest, yet most enduring staples of Depression-era America. At its core, it was nothing more than cornmeal slowly boiled in water or milk until it thickened into a soft, porridge-like dish. Cheap, filling, and endlessly versatile, it became a lifeline for families trying to stretch every penny and every ingredient during the hardest years. In the mornings, it was often served hot in bowls with a splash of milk, a sprinkle of sugar, or a drizzle of molasses if the family could spare it. At night, leftovers were poured into a pan, cooled until firm, and then sliced into squares or rectangles. These slices could be fried in a bit of fat or butter, turning them into something hearty and satisfying, a meal that could feel new even though it came from the same pot. For children, cornmeal mush was comfort food, even if it came from necessity. It warmed empty stomachs and carried a sense of routine in a time when life often felt unstable. For parents, it was a blessing. A bag of cornmeal was inexpensive, lasted for weeks, and could keep a household fed when nothing else was available. This dish also connected generations. Cornmeal mush had deep roots in early American cooking, going back to native traditions and pioneer families who relied on corn as a staple crop. By the Depression, it had become a common dish across the country, especially in rural areas where cornmeal was abundant. It may not have been glamorous, but cornmeal mush was survival on a plate. Every bite told the story of resourcefulness, patience, and making the best out of very little. Families didn't see it as a luxury, they saw it as proof that even in the toughest times, food could still bring comfort. Today, cornmeal mush has faded into memory, but for those who lived through the Depression, it will always be remembered as the dish that never let them go hungry. Ersatz coffee, sometimes called poor man's coffee, was one of the most unforgettable substitutions of wartime and Depression-era America. Coffee had always been part of daily life, but during these years, it became painfully scarce. Rationing and high prices meant that a real cup of coffee was often out of reach. But instead of giving up, families got creative. They brewed substitutes, sometimes from roasted chicory root, barley, acorns, or even ground-up dandelion roots. The goal wasn't to replace the rich flavor of true coffee completely, but to recreate the ritual. Mornings still began with something hot and dark in a cup, even if the taste was a little bitter, a little earthy, or just plain strange. For many, it wasn't about what was in the mug, it was about the comfort of holding it, sipping it, and starting the day with something familiar. In households across America, these substitutes became symbols of resilience. A pot of chicory coffee brewing on the stove carried the same sense of routine as the real thing. Soldiers' families drank it at home while their loved ones fought overseas, reminding them of the sacrifices everyone was making. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept the spirit of normal life alive. Some even grew to like the taste. Chicory, for example, added a rich, roasted depth that some families continued drinking even after the war. For others, it was a reminder of hard times, a flavor tied forever to ration stamps and shortages. Ersatz coffee may not have been the real thing, but it carried real meaning. It showed that even when the world was rationed and restricted, people could adapt. They could keep small rituals alive and find comfort in the ordinary, even if it wasn't perfect. Today, these coffee substitutes have all but disappeared from American kitchens, but their legacy remains. They remind us that survival wasn't just about filling stomachs, it was also about holding on to the traditions that made life feel normal. Spam hash, or canned meat hash, was one of the most defining dishes of wartime America. With fresh meat strictly rationed during World War II, families had to rely on what was available, and that meant canned products. Spam, introduced in the late 1930s, quickly became a household staple. It was cheap, it lasted on the shelf, and it could be used in countless ways. One of the most popular? Frying it up into a hearty hash. The recipe was simple, yet filling. Chopped spam or any canned meat was fried with diced potatoes, onions, and sometimes peppers if they were available. The sizzling sound in the pan and the savory aroma gave families a sense of comfort. Served with eggs at breakfast or with bread at dinner, spam hash provided energy and warmth when options were limited. For many, this dish was more than food, it was part of the war effort. Spam wasn't just eaten at home, it was also shipped overseas to soldiers. Families took pride in eating it, knowing they were sharing the same meal as loved ones fighting abroad. It connected the home front to the battlefront, turning a can of meat into a symbol of unity and sacrifice. Children often remembered the taste fondly, not because it was fancy, but because it was always there. It filled empty stomachs when little else could, and in tough times, consistency mattered more than luxury. The hash stretched one can of spam across an entire family, proving once again that creativity and resourcefulness could transform scarcity into enough. Today, spam hash may sound old-fashioned, but for those who grew up with it, the memory is powerful. It represents survival, adaptability, and the quiet victories of families who learned to make the best out of whatever they had. A sizzling skillet of spam hash wasn't just dinner, it was resilience served hot.